Good evening and welcome to the second Japan-Brazil panel of the year. This event is organized by the Japan House São Paulo and the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas to discuss some of the main matters in the international agenda, bringing together specialists from both countries. Tonight, the topic of discussion is gender inequality in international institutions and in global politics. We are delighted to introduce our panelists who kindly accepted our invitation to join the discussions on an important matter, and also at a symbolic time of the year as we approach International Women's Day on March 8th. Mariko Saito joins us from Japan, and she's a consultant in the gender team at UNDP, and Mrs. Renata Giannini is a senior researcher at Igarapé Institute. It is part of our protocol to highlight that all statements expressed during this event exclusively represent personal opinion and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. Also, all present here agreed to participate and have consented to be recorded on this broadcast, which will be later posted on FGV's official channels. The audience can send us questions during the entire event through the Slido platform. After the expositions, we have a few minutes to discuss and answer those questions. I now invite Professor Dr. Pedro Brites, coordinator of this project, to give us his welcome wishes.
Thank you very much, Luana. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is well and safe. It is a great pleasure to start the second Japan-Brazil panel. Discussing gender international politics is an essential topic today. In a week that marks the memory of women's struggle for equality, it is an honor to receive Mariko Saito and Renata Giannini here tonight. I want to thank you both immensely for having accepted our invitation. I'm sure it will be a great night of reflection and debate. And I also want to thank Japan House São Paulo for the partnership and support. And I wish you all a great event. Thank you very much.
Now to start our panel, I'll give the floor to Mrs. Saito, who has over 20 years of experience in promoting gender equality and women's empowerment globally and in Japan. She received her MA in Asian Studies from Cornell University and BA from Sophia University in Tokyo. She has held the position of program manager and later became a consultant at the gender team at UNDP, having worked as a trainer for UNDP in Bratislava and in Mongolia. Currently, she is also the director of a Japanese NGO called Gender Action Platform. She specializes in mainstreaming gender into the Sustainable Development Goals, women in leadership, as well as the relation between gender and climate change, and also disaster risk reduction. Thank you very much, Mrs. Saito.
Thank you, Luana. Thank you, Dr. Pedro. And a warm welcome to everybody. Good morning from Tokyo. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to connect. So given the time constraint, I'm going to jump straight into my presentation and would like to share the screen. Sorry, this is, hold on, I'll be. Just a quick addition to the kind introduction. My position at UNDP is actually quite a while ago. So currently I work for the Gender Action Platform as a director, and it's a small NGO. We do mainly policy advocacy and research. And my colleagues also advise the government of Japan. I hope you see it now. Yes, okay. So I shall start. Is that clear? Okay. And so, and also in addition to my work with the NGO, I wear different hats as independent consultants. For example, for UNITAR, it's a UN training and research institute based in Hiroshima, which I do a training for women leaders from Iraq, Afghanistan, the Pacific Islands. And then only recently till end of 2020, I was a national coordinator for a multi-institutional program with the UN Women, ILO, and the EU that promotes gender responsive business in the G7 countries. And that's why we had a sub-project in Japan. So my discussions will be sort of a mixture of the information or my experience from all that. But I also thought, given this exchange opportunity, I will share our challenges in Japan along with the prospects. So I'm starting my presentation just to give you the context or the broader context of our global work on promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. And I see it in 3 different phases, the very first one starting from the human rights and social justice. This is our foundation, and it doesn't stop. This is our basic foundation that we work under. Is where gender equality is seen as it's a human rights and social justice. It's a right thing to do. Women's rights is human rights. We all know that famous comment by Miss Hillary Clinton at the Beijing conference. So this is where we stand on firmly. It's a rights issue, because this is important for us in Japan. The rights issue, the rights approach is something that is less understood. And so we really continue to sort of need to remind ourselves about this. And then the second phase I see, it comes around in the 2000s, where we have an added sort of discourse that gender equality is smart economics. And I'm sure Dr. Renata would know about the famous World Bank report, Investing in Women in Smart Economics. And at the time when that came out, it was a huge sort of a hit for us, working especially in the international development arena, because it added sort of the width and the breadth of our discussions and sort of the way we work on and promote gender equality. And then now that I look back at that time, because everything was kind of coming up at the same time, I think probably the biggest reason was that we had sort of broadened the stakeholder who were involved in working on gender equality, and the private sector had become a sort of a major stakeholder in the global economy, in the global international politics as well. And so that's when the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, which I will share a little bit later, that had come into place, or the guiding principles on business and human rights. And so there was a shift in the discourse of international development, where and then gender used to be sort of placed as a social issue, but really moved into the mainstream economic issue. So a lot of the efforts of our colleagues, or many academicians and researchers, had been put into place. And also I think later on we started to hear about a lot of evidence-based sort of evidence coming out of research. The Global Gender Gap reports, another big push for us in Japan, because this really is influential in Japan. McKinsey or Goldman Sachs Womenomics had led to a change in a policy in Japan as well. So we now, from there, we've started to hear that gender equality can improve the GDP, is good for corporate performances, it can reduce risk. And also in the midst of, increasing natural disasters, we also heard there was a research saying that for a society that is gender unequal, that is more unequal, there's likely to have, for example, if it's more unequal for women, there's a likelihood that the mortality rate for women would be higher. So these evidence started to come out and really sort of built on our work. And then came the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, in 2015. And the sort of the added layer would be that gender equality is a precondition for sustainable development. And of course, it didn't suddenly spring up in 2015. There was a lot of sort of work that went through up to that point. And but for Japan, again, this was significant, because Japan used to, during the MDGs time, used to be sort of the donor country and the others working on gender equality, and kind of sort of left that, domestic issues in a separate sort of agenda. But now with the SDGs, it's all in it. We're all in it together, which had, I think, pushed our work in a new level. And also there had been a lot of, I think, changes and improvements, even in the G7 or the G20, the big head of states discussions, that the leaders' declaration would be gender will integrate gender issues into their declarations, etc., or the large UN conferences like on climate change or investment also start talking about gender a lot. The UNFCCC is actually, I was with UNDP back then, and when the first time gender went into the official document was 2009. So it's a accumulation, it's accumulation, but at the same time, these are happening really steadily. And thanks to that, we are able to move the agenda forward also in Japan. So this is the background. I've just listed some of the commitments. So if you're interested, you can go back and have a look at them. But I think the G7 Italy Taormina, the roadmap for gender responsive equality, this is working. We see ourselves in Japan sort of seeking the government's accountability to really work on this. But it's not just the government. I think the private sector also needs to do a lot of work, and the private sector, when it starts changing, can actually really sort of make a huge shift. So we are trying to work with both sides. I think this is the UN's UN Women's Empowerment Principles is pretty popular in Brazil. Brazil is actually the top in terms of the number of signatures. So I won't go too much into it, but basically this is a framework that guides all businesses, regardless of size, sector, or geography, how to empower women in the workplace, marketplace, and the community, and with the highest commitment from the CEO, and then the company, it guides the company. It gives sort of measures and frameworks for companies to be able to work in a gender responsive way. And currently, I checked the number last night, and globally there are 4,531 companies signing on the WEPs. And my colleagues, I used to work on promoting the WEPs in Japan with the global secretariat. And my colleagues were saying that in a month, there's about, at least 100 companies signing the WEPs right now globally. And it's a very sort of a new sort of a move. For the past couple of years, the number is increasing very rapidly. And why is that? Is because it's based on the understanding now that gender equality increases corporate performance and promotes sustainability. And it responds to the company's needs, like strengthening compliance with the laws and policies, or wanting to ensure better talent management, to make itself a socially responsible brand, or improve their value chains, etc. And the biggest shift that we see in Japan in terms of the private sector, which is really working, is the investors' engagement, and then a strong interest from the investor side to promote diversity. And I recently read a report from the Bank of America, I think also was issued a comprehensive report talking about how gender equality it talked about the GDP, that I think with the full gender equality globally, that the global GDP can be pushed up to $28 trillion. And it also mentioned a lot about the companies, how it can improve the performances. So the interest is very high. And like I said, Brazil is number one. Japan is two, because of the past sort of, there was a lobbying for signing, and not exactly sort of reflects the gender equality sort of conditions in Japan, but still we rank at third. But then other companies in other countries are really sort of adding the numbers. And in terms of the investors, I won't go into detail, but this is a very famous NPO called Equileap, and they are specializes in evaluating corporate performances on gender, and they have a gender scorecard, and based on that, there are a lot of financial indexes, etc., being put in place right now. And they also issue reports like the top 100 performing companies. The companies in Japan will not be ranked up at the top 100, not just yet, but we had an Asia report come out in 2019. But anyway, I wanted to share with you was that here, these are the scorecards, and the companies are evaluated based on this. And if you see this 18 commitment to women's empowerment, it actually asks the company if it's a signatory to the women's empowerment principles. So this is sort of for us in Japan, when we promote to the business sector, that this is happening globally. And then it's not just the Equileap, but it's Bloomberg. They have a gender equality index, the World Benchmarking Index. And these are, especially like the World Benchmarking Index seems to be very becoming prominent in Japan. And then Dow Jones doesn't have a specific reference on the webs, but the gender data that they require the companies to disclose pretty much follow the same criteria. So this is these sort of changes in the global arena had really impacted Japan. So I want to move a little to share with you some of the recent developments in Japan. Unfortunately, globally, Japan's rank continued to decline, and the most recent report that came out from the World Bank, Women, Business, and the Law to 2021, Japan ranked 81 out of 190 countries. And I checked, Brazil was 60. And Japan's rank went down from 74 in 2020. And the report noted that Japan had not taken any sort of major steps. It was business as usual for the past year, but then the rank went down, which means that other countries are raising their ranks. They're working harder and moving faster. The same can go for the Global Gender Gap Report 2020 from the World Economic Forum, where Japan ranks 121 out of 153 countries. And this was down from 110 in 2019. We're actually stumbling down the hill since the report started in 2006. And it was a huge shock to the general public in Japan. Us working on gender in Japan kind of saw it coming, because the key reason for this is because irrespective of, I don't know, many of you might have heard about Abenomics or the Japan's policy on gender mainstreaming, how they promote the society in which women shine. And this had started in 2013, around that time. And it's not like Japan is sitting around doing nothing. But the rank is going down globally. And you probably also read about the news of the recent remark made by the former chairman of the Tokyo Olympics Committee, undermining women's role in the decision-making positions. So that is still very much there. So, I mean, globally, we're not surprised, but then it did come as a shock to, I think, the larger public. And the reason why is because Japan has been working on things, but it's sort of working around the core issue of this. It's the lack of women in leadership and decision making, which you can see in these data, like the women in parliament. We only have 9.9% in the House of Representatives, or the ratio for the private sector is also still very, very low. And women and many of the policies are put together, the previous policies, the earlier ones are put together based on women as a labor force only. Basically, the population is shrinking, the labor market is shrinking, and oh no, we need more labor force. And oh, we have the women. And so some of the words that were used in the earlier time was like not advancement of women, but utilization of women. And so us women sort of felt like you've been putting us into this sort of, you know, we've been really working hard to sort of fight the inequality, but now you're saying that you want to make use of us. And so it was a strong sort of a backlash from the women's side. But then we have this very rigid structural and also sort of a cultural sort of the barrier that we need to work on. And so there's still the deep-rooted gender biases, both conscious and unconscious. And these policies, they're in the early 2000 around the 2013, around that time, there were a lot of policies on childcare, providing sort of more support to childcare or maternity leave, etc. And also building the nurseries so that women can work. But then that was also based on, it didn't consider the fathers taking care of the babies. So it was only sort of looking at women, because it was these policies were made by decision makers who would still hold that gender bias, both conscious and unconscious, that women take the care responsibilities. So the heavy burden of unpaid care work on women remained, and it had not been addressed all that much yet in the earlier time. And then the issue on violence against women, like the sexual harassment at workplace, is there's no legislation that penalizes that. So companies are encouraged to work to address it, but then they're not penalized for that. So these are the core issues that need to be looked at. But then I think in the earlier years, Japan had sort of tried to work around these core issues, and so that's why we haven't been able to see so much of the changes happening and lagging behind. And of course, there is the, when we have an unequal society and during the disasters or crises, you know, in gender inequality in normal times increase the vulnerability, and then it's exacerbated at times of crisis. So the COVID-19 hit really hard on the women, the negative impact on women. And some of these are the older data still coming out. A lot of research is continuing, but overall we see the unemployment, women losing their jobs, not just here it says unemployed decreased rapidly, but then these numbers are not correct because the women working in the informal sector or doing the part-time job sector are not reflected in these numbers. So actually the estimate is that it's probably double the number. What was shocking was the number of consultations, just like I think globally it's been reported about the increase of DVs and violence, but in Japan too, the number of consultations received at the DV support centers were 1.6 times higher in May and June compared to the same months before. And the female suicides had gone up the highest record in the past 5 years. So there's a lot of challenges that we are facing in Japan, and I wanted to share with you the public and private sector actions to date that I kind of picked that are relevant. And I see sort of a change from, well, this is not like a very concrete change, but sort of like a change in phase. I see SDGs as one of sort of a milestone. And before, some people might say, you know, the effort started from the Abenomics into 2013, but I think with the SDGs came into place, and then after that, because the world is watching now, and Japan has to also work on all the different goals, and also because of the global sort of the change in the business sector and the private sector of shifting its course and looking into diversity, and also I mentioned about the PRI, the investment. So there are more investors, Equileap, and the ESG investment, environment, social, and governance investment is also very much increasing in Japan. So the private sector started moving along with the public sector. What helped largely was this Act on the Promotion of Female Participation and Career Advancement in the Workplace. This is a temporary, time-bound 10-year legislation where it asks the companies, initially it was companies with over 301 employees, and now it's down to 101 employees, to disclose their gender data. And it opened a Pandora box. I mean, many of the companies were suddenly looking around and say, oh where do I stand? Are we doing okay? And then people, I think the companies really started to put together the policies. Those who already had been working on it were actually, I think, and then the government pension fund, based on all of these quantitative data that came out after the act, asked the MSCI Japan to put together a ESG index on that looks at these companies that are scoring higher, that are doing better when they disclosed information. So all of a sudden, this is sort of the time where the private sector, it was like a wake up for the private sector in Japan, saying that, oh my goodness, you know, actually this needs to be done. And actually we can show that there's a positive incentive for the private sector to work on gender. And then also, there was the 30% Club Japan that was launched. I don't know if you know about the 30% Club, but it's a group of CEOs working on making sure that the board of directors, women's share is at least 30%. And it in Japan, it made a big difference because after, oh gosh, something's not happening, but it actually, the members of the 30% club, the companies, they're very large companies, and then the numbers of women on boards for those companies had actually increased for up to 20%, like 21% in the major stock market within a year. And so that commitment from the CEO level had really impacted I think was a big news for us. And that led to Keidanren, which is the biggest business group in Japan, to ask that their members that are large companies actually really work harder to increase the number of women in executive positions. And while all that is happening in 2020, the government was steadily working to put together its new 5th Basic Action Plan for Gender Equality. And a lot of the consultations went in, and now we have a very comprehensive one. So I think, and now in the current sort of the discussion in the government right now, we're looking at the bill to revise the Act on Child Care and Caregiver Leave, so the paternity leave can be promoted harder. So that will be probably help in shifting the gender division of role or the different roles and the care issue a lot. And we're looking forward to that happening. Oh, that came out just now, but so that, yeah, the club, 30% Club Japan is leading the work in the private sector. And in addition to that, I want to just share quickly that we have had a lot of grassroots actions taking place thanks to the social network, I think. The most recent one, not the most recent, but then about the COVID-19 one, for example, right after it hit, a research group got together, and NGOs, and then some academicians, researchers got together right in July and did a mass survey, 1,800 single mothers, and to ask about what are their needs, what are the issues and challenges that they're facing. And that was put into a very comprehensive report that we put it on media. My colleague from Gender Action Platform does a lot of policy advocacy linking the NGO and the government. So we did, there was a media press release then, and then immediately the Minister of the Gender Equality decided that she will take up a working group and then to address this issue. So that discussion with the grassroots and linking with the policy level has starting to happen, which wasn't there at all, I think, back in maybe 5 years beforehand. And we see the commitment of the the government that way. And with thanks to social network, there's a lot of voices that used to be unheard coming out. One of the biggest, I think, the change was made was this Believe I Know It campaign, where the Japan sex crime laws had been untouched for 100 years. And like the penalty or the number of years in terms of the punishment and all that it was really like unheard of. So there was a campaign with the social network and NGOs getting together, and that led to actually a change of the law. So I think the feminist movement, and it's growing, and not just sort of feminists, but really many different diverse groups of women and men, young women and young men, are now working on addressing the issue. Especially this was seen at the petition by the No Youth, No Japan over the sexist remark of Mr. Mori, the former chairman of the Tokyo Olympics Committee. And immediately the petition started on change.org, and then over 150,000 signatures were submitted. And this was huge. And this really moved, I think, the big sort of the mountain was moved. And the good thing was it didn't talk about just his problem, but we talked about the structure or the governance issue, and the structural inequality was mentioned. So there are other things happening in Japan. I'm running out of time. I just wanted to share with you with the global movement. Japan is lagging behind a little bit, but then we're still trying to catch up, and a lot of us working on the issue in Japan. We see things are changing and moving forward. So this is just a glimpse of what's happening in Japan. And if you have any questions, I'd like to take it later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Saito, for bringing your perspective and all your experience to our panel. We once again encourage the public to send us questions through the Slido platform. And now we invite Dr. Renata Giannini from UNDP Institute to the floor. She received her PhD in International Studies from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, USA, and her master's from Santiago Dantas International Relations Program in São Paulo. She is a specialist in international security and in particular fragile countries, peace and peace operations, and the gender, peace and security agenda. She has received multiple grants and scholarships to pursue her research, including a Fulbright sponsorship to complete her PhD studies in the US. She has also participated in various workshops and validation seminars coordinated by organizations such as the UN and the OAS on gender, peacekeeping, and security. She has also carried out fieldwork in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, including the Democratic Republic of Congo and Haiti. Mrs. Giannini, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here today and share this panel with Mariko. So we're going to move a little bit from economics to international peace and security. First, I would like to present you to UNDP Institute. I don't know if those who are watching us know the institute where I work. It's a think and do tank. That's how we like to call it. It's basically a research institute, but is focused on influencing public policies. And the main areas where we work are climate and security, international peace and security, public security, and cyber security. I've been working there for a while, and I'm mostly responsible for all our gender, violence against women programs and projects. So to start, I would like to ask, I mean, of course, it's not a lecture and we are not in person because we have this awful pandemics going on, but why is it important to discuss and to talk about gender when we're talking about international politics? And of course, I know that most of our lovely audience know what gender is and all these social constructs that influence not only what women, men can do, but also how we talk about it, the impacts that policies has. So rather than speaking about gender international politics, it would be a lot better if all different topics within international politics would consider gender as a very important dimension because it has very strong impacts. But moving on and focusing a little bit more on my main area of expertise, when we think about a war, and we think about the first image that comes in mind when we think about women in war. What is that? Well, in the lectures that I usually give in person, most people tell me that the image is a woman, she's alone, or she has a child with her, or the elderly. It's basically an image that relates a woman as a victim. And that's a very important image because indeed, women are the primary victims of conflicts worldwide. It's over 90% of the victims conform women. However, they are not only victims, they are also an active part of the conflict. And sometimes this active part is forgotten, is completely forgotten. So I have the data from a research from a few years back. It's actually a little bit outdated, like a decade or so. And it considered 55 active conflicts worldwide. In 38 of them, they found women as combatants, either in the armed forces or the guerrilla or other factions, but they were active part of the conflict and they were combatants. They were not only the victims. Now, it's very important to bring this gender dimension to the conflicts because conflicts affect women, men, boys, and girls differently. Even if we only consider this dimension of them being victims, when we do a gender analysis, we can better understand what are the primary forms of violence that affect each of these groups. So just as an example, boys are mostly affected by being child soldiers, for example. The girls can be sexual slaves, and so on. So the list is endless. Here I'm just giving you a few examples that we really needed to consider all these impacts, because if we consider those impacts, then the policies that we plan to stop these impacts, they will be a lot more effective. And we usually do not pay attention to that, unfortunately. Now, it's at the same time, it's very important to consider that there is a continuum of violence. And I'm gonna get to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, this agenda that I am very much obsessed about in a minute. But sometimes we think that most of the problems that we find in a society that's going through war arrived because of the war or during the war. And in fact, what we realize is that these were conditions that existed before the conflict, and they only got worse during the conflict. So there is a continuum of violence in the case when we talk about the impact of war on women. And one of the major impacts, and unfortunately, it's very good that it's something that is being a lot more recognized and talked about. For example, when it happened in Japan with the women in Japan, sexual violence being used as a weapon of war, it didn't really have an impact. Only now we are talking about what happened back then. And so when we talk about the impact of war on women, we usually focus on sexual violence. And of course, that's very important because sexual violence is currently being used as a weapon of war in many different countries, but it's not the only impact that it has on women. And sexual violence did not start with the conflict. It's something that happened before the conflict and only got a lot worse during the conflict. And it is something that we will have to pay attention when this society transitions to peace, making sure that peace negotiations and the treaties and so on, they include these issues. And unfortunately, what we realize is that they don't include these issues. So having that in mind, in the year 2000, the United Nations launched, the Security Council launched a very important resolution, Resolution 1325, which inaugurates the Women, Peace and Security agenda. What this resolution has that it's very interesting is that it's not only focusing on women as victims, even though it recognizes these differentiated impacts that wars have on women and that had previously not been really recognized or fully addressed. But it goes beyond because it sees the importance of women participating in all phases of conflict resolution, be it as mediators, as part, or recognizing their role in the conflict itself. So having women participating in all those things. And how we came about to having these discussions. My colleague already talked about the many different international legal instruments, so I'm not gonna go into that very deeply, but I would like to just say that from the year 90s onwards, after we have the big conferences on women, what we see internationally when we talk about war is that a lot more internal conflicts and a lot more civilians being targeted and being victimized, not only those soldiers, official soldiers in a war, let's put this way. And with that, a lot more international norms that are focused on the individual arise. So having these norms focused on individuals, having these increasing importance of the agenda related to women's rights, along with the understanding that war has a differentiated impact in the different gender groups. So that's the conditions that were missing before, so that we have the Women, Peace and Security agenda. As I mentioned, this agenda inaugurated in the year 2000. And afterwards, until last year, in fact, we have 9 other resolutions. All these resolutions, they try to strengthen the normative framework to address the impacts that wars have on women, and at the same time to encourage women's participation in all peacekeeping, peace building, and conflict resolution efforts, and recognizing the fundamental importance of having them participating in all these solutions if we are to achieve a truly sustainable peace. Now, the Women, Peace and Security, it has 4 different pillars. So you have participation, which is, of course, more women. You have protection, which is protecting women from these horrible effects that wars have on them. You have humanitarian assistance, which is making sure that all humanitarian assistance efforts take a gender analysis under consideration. And very importantly, we have prevention. And I left prevention as the last one because 21 years after the launch of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, prevention has been the pillar that has been the least successful or the least dealt with by the different states. So when we talk about prevention, we are talking about empowering women. We are talking about putting women in a condition that makes them less vulnerable to any form of violence or to these different impacts. We're talking about political participation. We're talking about economic empowerment and the recognition of their role and having conditions for their individual and collective development. So this has been something that has not really been addressed internationally. This is something that the international community has struggled with. Before I talk about Brazil, which I will do in 1 minute, something that is very important is like, but why talk about having more women all the time? Why we should care about these things? And in 2015, the United Nations launched a global study that evaluated the advances of the Women, Peace and Security internationally. And one research that was commissioned found that having more women in peace negotiations increased the chance of peace lasting after a conflict resolution for 20%. So that's pretty good. So we should really take our chances here. And the main reason being because they pay attention to the causal effects, or the causes of war, rather than just those conditions that would put an end to a war, the immediate conditions. They look into more structural causes. Why women look into more structural causes? That is something that we need to look to understand better. But that's the main reason. Now, talking about Brazil started to pay more attention to the Women, Peace, Security agenda more recently. It was only in 2017 that it launched the National Action Plan for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Initially, this plan was supposed to last for 2 years, but it was renewed in 2019. And my guess is because the conditions to talk about gender or women in the current political context was a bit challenging. So that's why it was simply renewed. And the model of Brazil's National Action Plan, it actually follows a lot national action plans that are that developed countries has. So it doesn't really recognize its internal problem, because although Brazil is not officially at war, we have a lot of tensions, a lot of conflicts that have warlike effects. And women carry a great burden, be it in the forests, like the indigenous women fighting for their land, or other traditional populations fighting again with illegal mining and so on. be it in the cities, a lot of women living in areas that are dominated by the organized crime. So they are the crossfire between the police and these groups. They lose their children to this war, and this has a huge impact in their lives. Or even in the countryside, we have a lot of women who are in the leadership of social movements. And they are targeted as not only as leaders, but as women, different from their male counterparts who are just targeted because they're leaders. They're targeted as women, so they suffer more gender-related violence than the male are. So this is a major problem within Brazil's National Action Plan. It doesn't really recognize the kind of conflict that it has inside, and it only talks about the conflicts that are outside and what can Brazil do to support conflicts elsewhere without really looking into its own belly. Let's put this way. There are also other problems. So it doesn't really address issues such as the very low participation of women in military forces, the fact that there is a ceiling for women in police forces. It does not talks at all about the impact that light arms and weapons and ammunition has on women. And so there are many challenges. Of course, there are a few good things because it recognizes gender as a very important element in its refugee and migration policies. But it has, in fact, a lot to improve. So now I'm gonna close in a minute, but just to add to the current context, what we see now is a very complicated foreign policy when it comes to gender equality. If in the past Brazil was always with advancing gender equality internationally, it's now not being really recognized for that. There is a prohibition to use the word gender and the general complete misunderstanding about its meaning. We see a systematic attack on the sexual and reproductive rights of women. The LGBTQI population is being ignored. So when we talk about the gender equality right now, it's being talking a lot more about equal opportunities rather than gender equality. And what we see is that Brazil is a lot more aligned to countries that violate the human rights of women rather than those that defend. It's being reported that in diplomatic missions, there are a lot more, there are religious groups participating rather than diplomats. But interestingly, the women, peace and security agenda in Brazil has not been attacked. And one of the main reasons, I think, is because it's not a very ambitious agenda in this country. It is very specific. It talks about conflicts elsewhere. And when it does talk about things that relates to Brazil, it talks about the military sphere, which is a sphere that is more well seen by the general public. So I will end here. It was just a very quick summary of women, peace and security internationally and specifically in Brazil. And if you have any questions, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Giannini. And without further ado, we have selected a few questions from the audience. I would like to start the debate myself with a question that actually comprises and is aligned with a few questions we received from the audience. Especially coming from an emerging country, still under development, I think it can be important to link a few of the terms that we heard tonight from your expositions and with our national priorities and goals as a country. In the sense, my question would be, how are gender equality and development linked? And how do they converge, or how can gender equality be a reflex or maybe a symptom of development or underdevelopment, for example? Thank you.
Who, to any of us, or?
To both of us, however you wish to proceed.
Okay. I will just give my 2 cents very quickly, because I'm pretty sure that my colleague here can talk a lot more, but there are a lot of research that shows that the way that a country treats their women, it tells a lot about how well it's in terms of prosperity it's doing. So when a country treats, in general terms, their women very well, then usually in economic, not only in economic terms, but more broadly, it's doing very well in terms of development as well. Women's participation, women's workforce, at least in Brazil, it's very much the majority is informal. It's not sometimes really recognized as a workforce. My colleague here spoke about the workload, the third and second journey of work at home, taking care of the children, and so on and so forth. So while a country does not recognize that, or it doesn't really do what's necessary for women to really develop beyond the private sphere, I don't think it will really be that developed. I'll leave to my colleague to reply to that one.
Yes, thanks. I just want to add, and thank you for the very important question. And I also want to reiterate what Dr. Renata said about women not just being victims or the vulnerable, but active agents, and that agents of change. And we see, I've seen many programs while I was working at UNDP gender team around the world, where when you empower women and you try to work on gender equality, it has a sort of a faceted result coming out. For example, when you invest in women, and when the women are able to gain income, and then they make sure their children go to school, or they make sure that the girls go to school, because they've lost that opportunity, but they really know that that's important. And that changes significantly, improves the community. It also, they take, it improves the health system, because women try to invest in that, so that they basically invest in the future, right? When you invest in the children, that means you're investing in the future. And when there's more income, so the children can go to school, the girls can go to school, and then there will be more opportunity in entering the economic market. Whereas she said, the informal women tend to be more in the informal sector, and that in itself for the economy too, that doesn't come out in the official record. So when you have more women in the workforce, the economy can grow. And then in that way, and then they can become consumers as well. So it's a very sort of a multiplying effect, where you empower women, and that's how back I mentioned about investing in women makes economic sense, and it's smart economics. There are many research, if you Google, that talks about the data and the research about that. And also, I think it was if I remember correctly, it was Action Aid or something, that they actually did a research on how to, if you invest in the care sector, 2% or something into the care sector, that can increase the employment rates as well. So working on gender equality, it's the right thing to do, but then it really, I think you're investing in a group that had been overlooked. Your population, half of the population that's been overlooked. And if you, by doing that, there's a multiplier effect, because it translates to the next generation as well. So in terms of, development and I mean, it's the same in Japan too. Our economy has been stagnating for a very long time. It's a difficult road ahead, but then if the companies are performing better, if the economy can grow better that way. And also a lot of that informal sector, the women in the informal sector, if that can be addressed, I think it will be very strong in terms of development. You mentioned something else, Luana, about symptoms of development. I couldn't catch, or did we answer a question?
Yes, you answered. It was related to symptoms of sometimes underdevelopment.
Okay.
But we can, I think we can go to our next question. Thank you very much. Other question we received was, how does the women, peace and security agenda is impacted by the context of democratic erosion, armed violence, and environmental crimes, for example, in Brazil or in the world?
Well, it's very much impacted. I think that one of the main things that this agenda brought was to look into the differentiated effects. And so when we look into, for example, the Amazon and the effect of illegal mining, for example, there is, of course, impacts that are shared. However, looking to specifically what indigenous women do within their society, they are the ones who, for example, go to the river and catch the fish and do a lot of things. So you have a direct impact there. Also, when you look into social movements, so for example, the women, the ones affected, it's hard to translate, I'm sorry. The ones atingidos por movimentos atingidos por barreiras. When you have women who are in the leadership, and there are many who are currently leading these efforts, they have received a lot of gender threats. We have Quilombola women who were raped because they were fighting for their right to their land. When we look into the communities, as I mentioned before, there are women who are targeted because of their relationship to a man in the organized crime, or women itself are being more and more impacted because they are becoming more and more involved with drug trafficking, for example. So when you look into incarceration of women, it has increased immensely in Brazil. So there are many different impacts that these dynamics have on women. And despite that, our legal framework in Brazil, it doesn't account for these impacts. We don't look into these impacts. We don't understand these impacts. We don't address them. So if we take the perspective of the women, peace and security agenda, and we look into democracy erosion, so the way that female journalists are being currently persecuted, or the way that they are being persecuted, how they're being persecuted, you see that there is a very clear gender component that, taking the perspective and the framework of the women, peace and security, would immensely help us not only to understand what's going on, but also to address what's going on. Thank you.
I think we can move further to our last question due to our time is almost up. Another question we received is, what are the gender dimensions of climate change? And what does a gender responsive climate change policy or strategy looks like? I think it really is, the main question is, what does it mean to have a gender responsive climate change action?
Is this for, would you like to respond, Renata, from your, I just don't have an overview.
No, you can go ahead.
When we were working at UNDP and trying to integrate gender into the the documents of the UNFCCC. The first one was to make sure that, I mean, climate change seemed, everybody looked at it, it's a scientific thing to do, and there's no gender issue involved. And so we had to do a raising awareness that when it impacts, the climate impacts people. And when it impacts people, that means there are different impacts with men and women. So that had to be set clear and to raise the awareness there. I think at this stage now, that's all understood. And then now the question is, how do we look at the differentiated impacts, or how do we address the different impact? So I think the action plan, the important thing is, again, having women in the decision-making when these actions are being decided, because they come with the view, the perspective of different layers of perspective, like we've discussed already. So that's sort of I think the bigger ones, especially when you work on forest deforestation, or in many of the different sort of the intervention that needs to be taken for the prevention or protection. When certain actions are taken, that it encourages women to be part of that. It's a very quick overview. Over to Renata, maybe.
I have a very quick, also, I'm not a very, I don't know much about it, but from what in our institute, what we do is usually we look into the different impacts that climate change has on women. And usually the burden is a lot more when you do talk about cultivation and crops and so on. So again, in a very broad perspective, I would say that climate change, international politics, everything has a different impact in each of the gender groups. And we need to understand that, not only in broad terms, but looking to that specific society in that specific region. So what's the impact of climate change in islands, and for those islanders, for the women, for the men, and so on and so forth. So I think this is my contribution more broadly.
Yeah, I also want to add, when we say climate change actions, they're, I think, broadly mitigation, adaptation, and adaptation more, a lot of the disaster risk reduction, the experiences that we've accumulated in that area can be directly linked to climate change efforts that way.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, we thank you so much for answering our questions from the audience. And as we approach the end of the event, I would like to inform that the Japan House has uploaded all events we have jointly organized as part of our cooperation project on their YouTube channel, and also with subtitles in Portuguese. And the link to the videos is on the description of this event on YouTube. The subtitled events from 2021 will soon be uploaded here too. And we once again thank Mrs. Saito and Mrs. Giannini for collaborating in the March 8th discussions here in Brazil, and we wish our audience a great night. Thank you very much.